How's it going, everybody? We are entering into period 9 today. Period 9 is probably the smallest portion of the course, but just like period 1, it deals with kind of the bookends of the course. So, just in the way that period 1 and partly 2 contextualizes the rest of the course, this sort of contextualizes the exit of the course and where these themes continue into modern day. There isn't a hardcore stop, but most of the content you'll deal with in period 9 will come exclusively from the 80s, kind of the Reagan years, or the things that the Reagan years symbolize. So that's what we're going to focus on primarily in our series of 3 videos covering period 9. So we'll start with kind of the context of where we left. We left off of the end of the 70s and kind of where the Carter administration sort of left things off. The Carter administration was sort of a reaction to a lot of the things we saw in the end of the 60s, early 70s, like the Nixon administration, Vietnam, and the Democratic Party begins to mobilize, change, and transform into what we would call the new left. It becomes much more liberal and becomes much more a youth movement. It would kind of be the equivalent of maybe what the progressive Democrats would be today than maybe the more moderate traditional Democrats are. But we see that really take hold. You think of maybe the 60s, like hippies, but it's not just a bunch of hippies. It's a lot of the youth movement. Civil rights really takes into that, social justice for sure. Like SDS, where you see this resurgence on college campuses really getting involved. And so when you look at the new left, right, the new Democratic Party, it's kind of a reaction to everything we saw in the 50s of that staunch conservatism, very kind of cookie cutter culture, if you will, of the 1950s. And that's where this kind of bowls out to. Then we are going to see now the Republican response to this new left and kind of how these two groups are going to butt head, where this is going to be seen in social changes and where this is going to be seen in political changes. So we're going to see where that really tracks throughout period 9. As always, we have our objectives, and so we're going to be looking at the context, which we just sort of discussed, in which we're going to see these issues of the 1980s, especially towards the end of the Cold War. The Cold War is still going on. We haven't really kind of talked about it as directly as we have since we hit the Vietnam War, but then it kind of maybe took the back burner, or maybe it lost central focus and steam because of other things, especially happening domestically, but also the lessening of tensions at détente under the Nixon administration. We also see the kind of the cause and effects of different policy debates. We're going to see, again, the role of the federal government. We're going to see a change here. What's going to stay the same, but especially a lot of debates and changes happening. We've seen a massive spike and an increase in the size and the role of government really since Roosevelt, right? Maybe like Teddy Roosevelt even. I'm saying the early 1900s all the way until about the 1980s. And there's going to be a sharp change, reaction to maybe like the Vietnam War, especially the Watergate scandal, the ineffectiveness of the Carter administration, and we're going to see where this comes to fruition. We can also talk about economic and technological changes over time. That's a big trend in period 9, a lot of a big tenet of the modern era. A lot of internal migration, especially happening in period 9. See, a lot of these themes we're going to be mentioning are things that we should have hit throughout the entirety of the course, that we're also seeing the final trends and kind of where those threads end up. And lastly, looking at sort of these kind of effects of what is American national identity looking like in the more contemporary time period, the 1980s on, or as this course labels it in period 9, 1980 until present. So the core content focus, rather than the thematic focus we looked at, but when we're looking at the core content focus, we need to be looking at the Ronald Reagan presidency. He is explicitly mentioned in the AP curriculum, and he is one of the few individuals that is actually mentioned by name. And so if they are mentioned by name, especially in the objectives, it really is something that we need to draw our attention to. Names like Lyndon B. Johnson, names like FDR, names like Woodrow Wilson, Names like Abraham Lincoln are these big names because there's a massive amount of change associated with those individuals. So we're definitely going to be talking a lot about Reagan. We're going to talk about Reagan's domestic, and we're going to look at Reagan's foreign policy in another video, and then we're going to talk about really how present does this go. We'll talk about a lot about Ronald Reagan himself and his presidencies, but also kind of the extension of his presidency of his vice president, George Bush Sr., that takes over, is kind of an extension of these Reagan ideas and ideals, and we'll see how long-lasting these are, how contemporary these ideas actually are. So we are going to see, just like we spoke about before, there was a rise of the new left, right? The new Democratic Party, more liberal movement that we saw in the 60s and the 70s. Think the civil rights movement, think the hippies, think the student culture movement. We're going to see a neoconservative movement, a rise of conservatism, and especially the rise of Reagan, who kind of typifies these ideas that really solidifies it, especially in modern day. By the end of the late 1970s, we're really going to see this sort of counter to the new left start to be born. And we can call them neoconservatives, new conservatives, the new right, is kind of reacting against all of the social protests and liberalism. An early kind of feeling that we see of this is we can trace it back to LBJ's running against Barry Goldwater, this uncompromising conservatism. And then we even see it so much in our friend Richard Nixon there at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s. Obviously, he gets derailed with the Watergate scandal, but he also does have some progressive reform as well. Reagan is going to be a sharp change from that. It's going to be this hardcore rejection, and it's not just the political movement, it's the social trends and movements we see in the 1980s that are much more conservative. It's, again, this response to the new left. We sometimes call them the new right. This is going to be very similar. The way that I like to think of this is think back to the Roaring 20s, the 1920s, and the responses that we have seen there to social change. This social kind of clash between the new urban rural values with the traditional, or the new urban liberal values versus the conservative rural values that we'll see. We're going to see with these Republicans a greater focus on business, trade, free enterprise, capitalism, balancing the budget and lowering taxes. And when we lower taxes, we're decreasing our income, right? We're decreasing our income as a government. And if we don't have as much money, we cannot spend as much money. So the offshoot of that, of letting individuals keep more of their income, the government cannot do as much for the individual. So the size of the government is going to be smaller. Everything about the size and the power of the government is going to decrease, deregulate. Maybe we call this a callback to possibly, this is why I like the 1920s, almost even a further callback perhaps to being very pro-business. Maybe we could make a claim here, maybe Gilded Age. I like the 1920s personally. But the only thing that's going to get stronger and larger is the United States military. That is a continuity. That is something that stays the same. Really, once we hit World War II, this is this constant that has never disappeared really since. And we look at this focus on what they believe is morally right in the United States, on the right side of the spectrum. This return to maybe traditional family values, kind of focus on criminal justice and things like that. There's this movement of return to prayer in public schools, a response against very liberal changes that had happened under kind of these democratic parties or movements like the hippies, definitely a hard rejection against that. Anything socially liberal like homosexuality, pornography, hardcore criminal punishments, like the death penalty for criminals becomes much more common at this time. And so there is this Republican, this right-wing kind of sweep over, this resurgence that really happens. This is really kind of summed up, if you really want to look at kind of getting inside the head of this neoconservative movement, is that these liberal programs we've seen in like the FDR administration or the Johnson administration under LBJ, that these social so-called reforms have actually made even more problems. Government is not the solution. government is the problem. And it's a famous quote by Ronald Reagan, and it really kind of sums up these new ideas about what government should be, that these safety nets are enabling these poor decisions to be happening. It's not only an economic degradation, but a social degradation of society. And we can even see this in, again, social movements. During the 1980s, there is this massive spike in rise of evangelists. So there's a religious movement for sure, especially these kind of TV evangelists where people are being reached through new technology, but spreading religion and religious social values and ideas heavily connected to the Republican Party, especially at this time. And sometimes they call themselves the moral majority. So there's a moral tone to what's going on. We've seen the effect of religion on movements, maybe in the reform movements in the early 1800s, the antebellum period with the Second Great Awakening, adding this moral connotation to it. There is going to be this attack on any form of major liberal change, like we see the Equal Rights Amendment, led by Phyllis Schlafly, who is fighting to shoot this down because they believe that this actually takes away rights from women. It's going to force them into non-traditional roles that are actually going to be worse for women in society. There's going to be this heavy fight against abortion, and probably the best example of this is the Supreme Court case Roe versus Wade in the 1970s that legalizes abortion anywhere throughout the United States. Right? And there's this argument of life beginning at conception, that the rights of the unborn, right, of the unborn child supersedes a woman's rights to control her own body. So yes, people have the right to control their own bodies, but not when they're taking away the life of another human being. And that is the way they're really going to be split on this issue of abortion, that they see it as a negative example of all of this liberal agenda, this liberal change. School busing programs that are busing children from different sections of the cities that maybe are the poorer, more rundown, poverty-stricken, crime-stricken areas into maybe the traditional like suburbs where there is a lot of, again, racial segregation, still de facto, even though we know by law it's changed, but de facto there are still a lot of changes. This emphasis on social welfare and handouts. And so, again, this is this movement that it's not only just a political movement, but a social there's what they believe to be a moral connotation and a tone to it that's going to drive a huge wedge in politics. And by the time we get to 1980, there's a lot of changes and things that really kind of rubble up that leads into this huge response of what I sometimes call a swinging pendulum, that people are moving in one direction until it hits one extreme. It hits the top of that swing, and things are going to swing back. Sometimes it's a slow swing, sometimes it's a sharp, aggressive swing. We saw the Watergate scandal, huge swing away from the Republican Party, and then we get to Jimmy Carter, and it looks like the Democrats are going to be taking more control back over, but the massive ineffectiveness of the Carter administration, the weakening role of the United States in the world, and especially the Iranian hostage crisis is going to swing hard back to the right, where the Republicans are going to be able to take office. We see the issue of stagflation, a stagnant economy, and inflation hitting at the same time is still a huge problem. The Soviets invade Afghanistan, the Iranian hostage crisis. America looks like we are crumbling, that we are falling apart at the seams. And so as a result, America is really calling for a hard line, stronger stance politician. And that brings us to our former California governor, Ronald Reagan. He is going to have this massive kind of neoconservative swell that really builds up, a massive wave of this Republican resurgence, and he is going to get the Republican nomination, and he is going to win in an absolute landslide. But when we talk about Reagan, there's a lot of interesting things about him. We can look at his political track, and so Reagan does have some experience. He actually used to be a Democrat, and he flips parties. He used to be the governor of California for about 8 years, and in the 1960s, he switches from being a lifelong Democrat to being a Republican. He's really influenced by Barry Goldwater, who gets absolutely trounced by LBJ in the election of 1964. But what's super important about Goldwater is this movement, this riling up of there is a bubbling conservative movement Not everybody is gung-ho about the hippies. Not everybody is gung-ho about this super liberal swing that's happening. And so there's a movement against it really coming up. He eventually does run for the Republican nomination. He doesn't get it in 76, but he gets it in 1980. And in 1980, once he gets it, he is going to take over. He's also an interesting individual because he's a well-known name. His experience before, he was a governor. He has political experience, but he used to be an actor in California, and so a lot of people do recognize him. He's sort of a household name at some points. He's got great public speaking skills. He's very persuasive. He's a great orator. But it also hurts where he's going to get a couple dings at his reputation initially that, oh my God, we're electing an actor. Like, what is this person going to possibly do? Some people won't necessarily take him seriously. We have this movie on the left, Bedtime for Bonzo. We have this guy who's doing a movie with a chimpanzee, and we're going to elect him as president. No. But eventually, once he gets in office, he's really going to start a movement. And it's not even just so much about who Reagan is and what Reagan does, but the effects of his administration going forward. And Reagan wins by an absolute landslide. Like, it is not close. And what makes it more important, this is a huge trend to note, because we've seen this happen in other periods of history. Reagan not only wins the presidency, which is a huge change that a lot of people can see because it's kind of a one-on-one race, if you will. When people look at these elections, it's easier to track. But also, the Republicans are going to take over Congress as well. So not only will you have a very conservative executive branch, but a legislative branch to back it up and get these legislations passed through. There are a majority in the Senate for the very first time since the Eisenhower administration, which was in the 1950s. And although they didn't take over the majority in the House, they really crushed the Democrats' previously trounced majority in the House. So they are really getting involved. Do they have complete control over everything? No, but they control the Senate, and it's getting pretty dang close in the House. So that's going to allow for more legislation to really move through. And the reason why this happens is it's not so much that there were just more Republicans that voted, but the Republicans, at least Reagan, was able to pull in Democratic voters who had been with the Democrats since FDR for a long period of time. We see a huge trend where women, blue-collar workers, and Southerners are voting in larger numbers for Reagan. And sometimes this group is referred to the Reagan Democrats. And that's not necessarily this huge quintessential term that you really need to know, but understand that the reason why he was so successful is he was able to pull in lots of other type of voters that for the past decades had voted for the Democratic Party. The only one that Reagan was not able to win, the largest voter group, constituent group, that Reagan was not able to get in a large statistical number was African Americans who actually stayed and voted for the Democratic Party. Carter runs again in 1980, so he tries to run for re-election, and he's going to get absolutely obliterated. This is what the presidential map will look like. We see red everywhere. It doesn't matter if you're out west, if you're in the deep south, the southeast, if you're in the Midwest, if you're in the Northeast, it doesn't matter. There is a large sweeping kind of swing all over, right? The only state in New England, right? If you're my students here watching this, right? That's us, right? Rhode Island is the only New England state that votes blue, right? The only Midwest state that votes blue is going to be Minnesota. Down south, you only have Georgia, you have Hawaii out there, and then you have Maryland, West Virginia, and Washington, D.C. that vote. But when you look at these numbers, he still wins over 50% of the popular vote, right? He wins, right, over 8 million more popular votes, and he absolutely trounces Carter. And kind of his message to the public about why, one of the reasons why I think he's so successful is more in practical terms. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And because of that, he is going to absolutely run through the election of 1980, and we begin the Reagan years, right? Reagan is going to be this this new kind of more modern politician He is very good at persuading and communicating with his career as an actor, and that's what he prides himself on, right? There's a lot of political action committees or PACs, heavy funding that he has that allows him to really mobilize and get out voters. And they use direct mailing kind of ballots and propaganda to really swing and use that. And it's really going to help in the election results, as you can clearly see. This is a huge turning point. 1980 is the end of period 8 and beginning of period 9. It is the election of Ronald Reagan is what I mark that year at because it is so important. This is a massive conservative swing, and the Republicans are really going to move along with this. Even the effects after. In the 1990s, there's going to be a two-term back-to-back president by the name of Bill Clinton, who is a Democrat, but he is going to keep a lot of these Reagan ideas that are going to trickle into the early 2000s even. And so this is going to be a huge turning point for a lot of politics, both political parties. This rise of conservatism, and we're going to see a little bit more of this back and forth, which we have seen since Clinton serves 2 terms as a Democrat, and then George W. Bush serves 2 back-to-back terms in the early 2000s, and Barack Obama 2 back-to-back terms as a Democrat, and then Donald Trump, a Republican, who's going for a back-to-back term again. And so we're seeing this flip-flop back and forth every 8 years. So today we're really going to focus on the domestic policy for Ronald Reagan, and we're going to see really where that conservative agenda fits. When I think Ronald Reagan, to me, the way that I always understand him best is through Ron Swanson, one of my favorite TV characters ever from Parks and Rec. He is so much sort of in line with like his jokes and his humor is very much in line with the type of policies when we look at Ronald Reagan. And so I'll definitely be throwing in a lot more memes and GIFs here as we go, right? But this idea of like the self-reliance, determination that government really is the problem. He's going to take down government from the inside, if you've ever seen the show. But when we look at Reagan, his real, especially his first term, is really focused on deregulation of the national government, freeing up businesses, being definitely pro-business, friendly to business, and kind of letting that go. He appoints conservative heads to the EPA, right, Environmental Protection Agency, to OSHA, which deals with kind of workers' rights and kind of health and safety organizations, the SEC, Security and Exchange Commission, and the Consumer Price Commission. And so they really focus on reducing government restrictions, really being pro-business. Less restrictions on air pollution, fuel efficiency, the wilderness, endangered species, stock market, really opening things up. And the idea was to take off what the Republicans saw as chains thrown on industry to let the economy grow and prosper. And we are going to put America back in a financially stable position by deregulating the government. Let capitalism run its course. Trust the process and let this bloom. And he's really going to try to limit this in a couple different ways. And we see, yes, the regulation, but the other way, and this is why we think of Reagan, we almost think about kind of flipping the clock back almost 100 years to draw some comparisons here. And when we look at Reagan maybe being a little bit more anti-labor, weakening the power of unions to, again, allow businesses to run more freely, take off these chains, these leashes, and let them run, that if things are being done responsibly, everything is going to be fine. That these restrictions and training wheels are only there for those that are not doing the right thing. And if we let that open, we trust the American capitalistic system, we trust the buyers, the consumers, the producers, that everything is going to work out just fine. He is going to find different ways to do it. For example, there's going to be an air traffic strike for these union members who are fighting against, they're striking against the wages, the conditions, and they want better rights and rebargaining. And so he's going to favor the businesses in this case and decertifies and the PACTCO members and fires the air traffic controllers when they go on strike and just kind of have other ways of breaking the picket line. These are different levels and different ways of handling this same scenario, but remember the core umbrella. You do not have to remember every single term, event, account, incident to be successful as a historian, to be successful in AP US history, or to be successful as an intellectual. What you need to understand is the broad strokes and try to find examples to prove that, whichever ones help fit your argument or really can at least fit in your brain. And when we look at the economic point of view, we're not just talking about deregulation, but the economic point of view, probably the biggest buzzword that gets slapped with Ronald Reagan is going to be something that we refer to as Reaganomics. Reaganomics is Reagan's economic plan, kind of in the same way that the Affordable Health Care Act under President Barack Obama gets labeled Obamacare, an unofficial name for it. But Reagan is looking at the economic situation of the United States coming off of the 1970s and looking at this issue of stagflation, the stagnant economy and inflation at the same time. And he blames it on government spending and high taxes. And so what he's hoping to do is try to flip the script of what we see in the blue, where the interest rates were at 20%, the value of the dollar dropped to just 36 cents to the dollar, and we're looking for ways to really flip that around to provide more sort of bang for your buck, if you will. And we are going to see his plan, and his plan is sort of two-sided. There's two steps to it. One, we refer to sometimes as supply-side economics. You are going to cut taxes by 25% over 3 years to allow people to have more money, and the individual consumers, it is believed, will then boost the economy. So the idea is every individual, if you get a paycheck, right, and if you get an actual paycheck, you're not getting money under the table, you're not getting paid in cash, but you get an actual paycheck. The worst thing is when you look and you see how much money is taken out of your paycheck for taxes. Right? Like you may be in high school, but you're getting taxed for like Social Security, or you're getting other state taxes. You're like, this is bogus. You're seeing all of the money that you may have earned, right? You worked for, and say you get $10 an hour and you work 10 hours over a weekend. You're thinking, yes, I made $100, but your check may come back at only like $67.28, right? Depending on your state taxes and things like that. But you're only going to get a portion really of what that paycheck actually was. And so that makes people kind of angry. And so if you could say that of the money that's being taken away from you, I can give you 25% of that back. It's not going to leave your pocket. You're going to get more of that money in your paycheck. You're not going to lose as much to taxes. People are going to be all about that. Right? They're getting more economic prosperity. So the government is going to not tax the individual citizens as much. But the counter side to that, there's a give and a take. There's no such thing as a free lunch, right? You're going to have to give something, right, to get something. And so the government is going to tax less, which means the government will have less revenue. And if the government has less revenue, the government can provide less for the people. So the size of government and the benefits that the government can provide is going to start to shrink. That's why it's called supply side economics. We are going to give money back to the supplying side from the federal government. Who supplies the federal government with money? The citizens through their taxes. So giving the supply side, the citizens, more of their money back, they are going to be able to then spur the economy on their own through their spending because they have more disposable income. And we are going to see the largest tax cut in U.S. history in 1981 called the Economic Recovery Act. It calls for a 5% tax cut in 81, the next year 10%, and then another 10% after that in 1983. And so again, over this 3-year plan, taxes are going to be cut by 25%. A lot of money going back into the American citizens' pockets, which everybody would love that. But remember, there is that trade-off. You have to decrease government spending by over $41 billion. And this idea of Keynesian economics, deficit spending that we see really started under the Roosevelt administration in the Great Depression, that says in order to jumpstart the economy, right, to get that multiplier effect going where I buy something from, say, like a car industry, And that's going to affect all these other industries, whether it's the automobile making industry, the rubber industry for tiles, the metalworking industry, the factory workers, the transportation of the car salesmen, the upholstery, the gasoline industry buy these purchases because they require so many things. The government is going to spend a lot of money and go into debt during a time of economic depression to get other citizens more money. And then those citizens can then spend and sort of reverberate the economy. This is kind of throwing that away and saying the government should not be spending this much money. The government should not be doing this much. It should be the individual citizens dictating the means in which our capitalism works, and the way that this buyer's market will be controlled really by the buyers rather than the government spending so much money, decreasing regulation. So it's this sharp change. And as I gave you this quote earlier, this is from Ronald Reagan: government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. So it is a sharp change. Again, it's that Ron Swanson mentality. He's going into government to bring the government down. Again, this is just another example of what we're seeing, where we don't need to know the specifics of this, right? Omnibus Reconciliation Act, right? It's cutting social services like food stamps, urban mass transit, student loans, the arts, right? Ways of getting that budget down, because you can't spend as much because you're not bringing as much money as a government. But there is one thing that is going to increase, and this is a staple of, we would say, even modern Republican Party today, even though it's changed through the different presidencies, the different decades from the 1980s. Military spending is going to jump to $2 trillion over 8 years in the Reagan administration. So everything will decrease and be cut down except for one singular thing, and that is going to be spending on the military. That is a key part of what we call the modern Republicans, this neoconservative movement. This is an example of Reagan explaining his so-called supply side economics to the public on television, right, using his charts explaining what's going on. The idea here is to create this perfect balance between what the government is taking in, i.e. tax revenue, we see here on the left, and the economic prosperity and fluidity of the individual citizen. So if you look over here on the very far left, if you collected zero taxes whatsoever, Americans keep all of the money that they want, but the problem is that the government has no money to be able to provide anything for the individual citizen. So that becomes a problem. So what happens when you go to the other extreme? The government takes every single penny that you work for and then is providing everything. There's absolutely no fluidity for the individual citizen. So it's not necessarily a 50% tax rate. And each government in each country around the world, and they change over history about what they deem to be acceptable, the best situation, we find this sort of balance. And we are going to be leaning more towards this A range, if you're looking at these letters here, more towards the A on the left, where we're limiting the amount of money that we're taking from individual citizens via taxes, but their cost is we cannot provide as much from a government standpoint. And we're also going to see this general trend on how this starts to impact unemployment rates over different periods of time. And when we're looking at the early years, this right here, it says the GNP, right, gross national product price deflator, right? How it's changed from the 60s, which would be the Johnson administration, all the way through. It's going to spike right here with like Ford and then into Carter, and the number is still steadily rising. 1980, right? Let's follow this line all the way up here. We see 1980 right here. This number is going to increase over this first year, right? By 1981, it's going to seem like nothing's happening. It's actually getting worse by 1982. However, there is a sharp change on the downward direction that we are going to see moving at this time as we go later into the 1980s, and it seems to justify what's being done. The Reagan tax cuts are going to continue 1982 into 1983. And so in 1983, the economy is booming, the recession ends, Americans are spending more money than ever, and that leads us into the election of 1984, and the economy is doing better than it's done really in the past 10 years. And so Americans are really like, why would we change this? Why rock the boat? Right? Even you go even further back into the 1960s, it's doing better than that. And so the United States is really, really like, let's not change this. And so the voters are really still going to stay with Reagan and look at these results. They look at, regardless of whatever else is happening, economic stability and prosperity is happening in the 1980s for many, many Americans. And so when we look at the benefits of this so-called Reaganomics, inflation, unemployment, and the trade deficit, right? So the gap kind of in our trading, we're wanting to export more than we're importing, right? All these problems where, say, trade deficit would mean that we're importing more than we're exporting. All of these problems are decreasing by 1990. Things have gotten better over the decade. A lot of service sector jobs are really going to grow during this time period as well. The service sector are things whether you could talk about like retail, banks, hotels, real estate. I mean, education would fall in that category. Computer services, media, communications, gas, water supply, like serving others, and 16 million new jobs are created. Unemployment falls below 6%, inflation falls below 4%, so things are doing really well. However, we know throughout history, not just US history, but world history, there is nothing that is completely absolute, that there are actually, not everybody is increasing or having a better opportunity. And so this is an awesome example of complexity that you could draw in. Industry drops are really going to fall because companies are going to be looking, because of the lack of regulation, they're looking for manufacturers outside of the United States, kind of we maybe call outsourcing, looking for cheaper ways to produce their products, to bring out, to sell, to increase their profit margin, for cheaper labor. Social inequalities are still increasing. There's a lot of racial tensions in the 80s and going into the 90s. And that not all people, right, are really being protected or provided for. And there's a huge call in the 1980s that's saying that there's a disproportionate number of African Americans that are being, one, incarcerated because of these stricter kind of Republican laws and targeting African American communities, and that African American communities are not being helped by this so-called trickle-down economics from the top down. It's never reaching the bottom. And we still do have this huge federal deficit that's not really being necessarily completely resolved. We can see this trend in the federal deficit here from 1980 when Reagan first comes into office all the way up to 1997. And so there is an increase that we see in the early 1980s, and then it's going to dip back down for a while. It's going to come back up to plateau. There is a period where it becomes quite low for, right, a 3-year period here. But as we get to the election of 1992, there is that spiking trend here that's really going to hurt the re-election chance of the president that comes after Ronald Reagan, George Bush Sr. The deficit was $70.5 billion in 1976, but by the time you get to 1983, it's $207 billion. By 1988, the end of the Reagan years, right after a second term is up, there were different countries that controlled 15% of our country's national debt. We're in debt to a lot of other countries. And lastly, we're also going to see sort of a ceiling that's set in 1993, kind of being the target end date to end this whole federal deficit that doesn't really happen. The Graham-Rudham Act, which is, again, it's another one that I don't think is necessary to this course. Most things in the 1980s are not completely essential, but trends that we can see continuing, right? Restraints on kind of federal spending, hopefully forcing Congress to balance the budget, and this downward trend that's going to happen for the future. So it's a little bit contradictory when we're looking at these actual results. It becomes a little bit muddled and complicated to really look at this economic legacy. I think it's hard sometimes for us to look at the broad spectrum when we're looking at every individual piece here, but it's actually a little bit easier when we can think about the individual impacts. So these charts, you're going to see the yellow is 1975, the orange 1985, the blue 1995. What percentage, right, of kind of household income is sitting in each bracket? And so you're going to see a trend here where the richest quintile, which is the richest fifth of American society, is going to have, right, that amount of the income. 21% of this kind of 48.7 or 21 out of the 48.7% is the top 5% of wealth. So the rich are getting richer, and the middle class and the poor are actually declining with the amount of income that they have in their own quintile. You're going to see this gap that's really happening where especially African Americans are going to be highly disadvantaged. And so that's one of the other reasons why the African American vote as a whole will not necessarily swing towards the Reagan administration. There's high employments in cities that doesn't seem to be fixed, it's not being addressed, sort of forgotten about, put on the back burner. And so there are definitely a lot of racial tensions, a lot of poverty, high crime rates, especially with the stronger stance or more aggressive hardline stance for criminal punishment we see under the Reagan years. When we also look at the 1980s, we really focus it on this idea of this connection of money. We see the hippies growing up and now they're in charge of their families. And so how do they change and adapt? And we see TV shows, we see movies, we see kind of American culture focusing on money and status and wealth in the 1980s. And so society is really growing up and changing. I love this picture over here on the left. We have the guy in sort of the hippie outfit and his little kitten now all grown up. You have the giant cat in the background now in the shirt kind of looking at each other in disgust, like, whoa, who were you? What happened to you? And so there's this stark contrast that's really happening between this change into the 1980s. We see the evolution of modern media networks like CNN and USA Today that become heavy publicizing everything that's going on and kind of being, again, sort of like that watchdog, if you will, of the American government. This is kind of stemming from the effects of Watergate, all this transition, right, since then in a very short period of time. Another trend we really see in period 9 is the trend of immigration. There's sort of a third major wave of immigration that we see in U.S. history. Like we can go all the way back to mid-1800s, the old immigrants, if you will. We see a massive wave in the Gilded Age for sure, end of the 1800s, early 1900s. We call them the new immigrants and all the restrictions that are placed in the 1920s. And of course, there are immigrants flooding to this country after World War II, the wars in Korea and Vietnam. But in the 1970s and 80s, there's a large general wave that's happening, a major trend we can see today, where immigration is a hot topic issue in American politics still today. We see a lot of immigration from Central America, whether it's from Mexico, Haiti, the Dominican Republic. It's definitely increasing, but the percentage living in poverty in the 1980s is definitely increasing as well. And so there's going to be a large immigration trend we're going to see into the Southwest, into Florida, and then up into the urban areas like New York City and the New Jersey area as well. We are also seeing immigrants from Asia, and think about why immigrants might come over from Korea or Vietnam. And again, that connection from the Philippines and where are they likely to settle the most? Where are the jobs going to be? Major cities, right? So we see a big pull, a little bit of a pull into Illinois and Texas, heavy pull into New York and New Jersey area, of course, but a massive pull into California. And so population is drastically going to increase. This is a continual trend that we are going to see today that's going to affect electoral college votes, seats in the House of Representatives. And it's really going to change Californian culture for sure. Larger waves of immigration that's really. The Reagan administration is also known for kind of opposing social reforms and changes. And so that's really going to trouble a lot of people. It's going to cause a lot of social conflict, perhaps, that's happening at the same time. High school dropout rates and crime is increasing in the 1980s. The affirmative action program, where African Americans are given perhaps if there are exact even sort of applications, if all other conditions are the same, that they may defer preference to African Americans. It's not saying that people of color are given a pass if another individual is more qualified, if these two individuals are equally as qualified, right, to help to turn out or change over series of decades and decades, even generations of inequality, centuries of inequality, attempting to change that. That's going to be fought against school busing, we already talked, from impoverished, highly diverse areas, or even just, we'll say just high African American communities living in poverty, or immigrant communities living in poverty being bused into traditionally more suburban districts, giving them better access to better education, better school systems. Those are going to be limited. However, at the same time, there are some gains for different groups that we can definitely trace to. The first female Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor, is appointed during the Reagan administration. We are going to see court case of the University of California v. Bake in 1978 is going to rule in favor of affirmative action, but not necessarily a particular quota, that there has to be a certain percentage of African Americans that are brought into a certain university, right, accepted in. And so there's definitely going to be a little bit of continuity, a little bit of change. And so if you can bring in that complexity, you can make a one-note argument. It will be very biased in your DBQs and your writing, but that's not going to give you the most complex argument. However, you can still definitely make that argument. But if you want to go into complexity, understanding both that there's continuity and change in every single decade and every single topical analysis. We also see, again, this discussion of women's abortion rights were attacked sort of by the Reagan administration as well. And it's again, the calming off of these changes that we saw in the 60s and the 70s. In the 70s, we see Roe versus Wade, right, had just legalized abortion. So that's even still a hot button topic today, that there's still fights to get cases to come up to the Supreme Court regarding abortion, try to overturn these rulings. So it's not an issue that's gone away, but it's definitely a hot button issue in the 1980s. The Republicans associated a lot of the problems that they saw in society with what had happened in previous administrations, and so they blamed it on kind of this new left movement. You're going to see, as the federal government as seen as being forcing this control that they want to give the individual states, citizens, civilians more control, that the federal government is stepping away, that they're not going to get involved in those things that we just talked about on the previous slide, like affirmative action, like the busing programs. They're also going to really look at things like drug use as being labeled and associated with the new left, like the hippie movement. And all of these things are rooted in all of the changes that we saw during this kind of new left wave of especially the 60s and then the 70s that they're sort of reacting to. And there's a huge problem with crack cocaine in the United States in the 1980s. Cocaine use is booming. But the Reagan administration is attempting to solve this. They're going to declare a war on drugs. Nancy Reagan is the First Lady is going to start her campaign, the Just Say No campaign, helps with educating children about drug use and gives over 100 different ways on how to say no to drugs and really kind of encouraging this rejection of it. As you can imagine, just saying no isn't necessarily enough to overhaul a lot of major changes that they're seeing. But there's also a lot of other problems of equity issues of the criminal justice system, where whether it be powder cocaine or cracked crystallized cocaine, they're going to be penalized differently, although they are the exact same drug in maybe a different form. Powder cocaine is seen more the upper areas of society. We're thinking like Wall Street. If any of you have ever seen the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, we see drug use prevalent in that film and that story. But crack cocaine being more prevalent in lower income communities, that this same drug, although it's a different form, is the exact same chemical compound, same drug, is penalized differently. That found in the lower income communities, crack cocaine is punished much more heavily, right? And those lower incomes pretend to be people of color. So African Americans disproportionately thrown in jail in this war on drugs. Meanwhile, the exact same drug being used by kind of the white 5% of society, the rich, the top upper echelon of society. That's the exact same drug is getting less time, unequal treatment, unequal representation in the criminal justice system, even through something like this. The government is also going to fail just in general in stopping the actual flow of drugs into the United States. Custom, the DEA, Coast Guard is trying to keep things out. different negotiations with other countries where a lot of these drugs are coming through from Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, right, are failing as well. And so although America is trying to just say no and prevent people from using drugs, they can't stop this flow of crack cocaine or cocaine in general or other drugs, illicit drugs, into the United States, which are definitely not supported by religious groups. And so this becomes a huge target, right? The moral and the ills, the immorality and the ills in society that they see. Although she says just say no many a times, they use cartoon characters, it's not going to work. Another issue that we're going to see that's going to be a cause of contention, and again, displacement of hatred, of anger, of division in society, is the AIDS epidemic that breaks out in the 1980s. The first documented case of AIDS is going to occur in the United States in the 1980s. In 1981, we see the very first cases in San Francisco and New York City, but it's only amongst gay men, homosexual men. And so there's going to be this association of this problem, of this evil, of this ill being associated with homosexuals. And so there's going to be a reaction to homosexuals for sure, and this kind of gay liberation movement, the rainbow power movement that we saw at the end of the 1970s. Cases are going to be found heavily with drug abusers and hemophiliacs, which are people that they are not able to stop the bleeding on their own. Their body isn't forming those platelets, so they're needing a lot of blood transfusion, a lot of needle work. There's going to be a lot of transferring of dirty needles. People are worrying about the U.S. blood supply being contaminated, that if blood was given from someone who had AIDS, that this would go into the national blood supply, the entire blood supply would be tainted, and then everyone could possibly be infected. And paranoia is really going to be setting in, but it's going to be lashed out especially at homosexuals, labeling this problem in drug use as well, all associated with these liberal changes that we saw in the 60s and the 70s. A huge lack of sympathy for gays, budget cuts, and also just general ignorance is really going to lead to a limited government response, because remember, the government is trying to shrink its control, and it's really going to go unaddressed. And as we look at this massive spike in 1983, there was 2,800 known AIDS cases. 2 years later, 12,000. 2 years later, after that, 50,000. By 2006, 982,498 AIDS cases confirmed in the United States, really in about a 23-year swing. And so this is really going to turn into a massive epidemic, not a pandemic. A pandemic is a worldwide issue like the coronavirus pandemic, right? But an epidemic at a general epicenter, which would be the United States, especially the urban areas. A lot of misconceptions, and so different posters are put out about how to understand what's happening with AIDS. You can't get AIDS in a restaurant by someone just touching plates, or you can't, if you drink from the same glass that somebody else drank from, no, you will not get AIDS. If your kids are playing hide and seek and tag and someone touches somebody and maybe they're contagious, that's not going to get it from. You're not going to get it from a public pool, right? That children aren't going to give you AIDS from just contact, but it's got to be bodily fluid. And so because of that, there's a lot of reaction. And I think you're going to see even this religious tone where people believe that AIDS is the wrath of God, right? Saying that increased support for liberal agendas, homosexuality, and all these liberal changes, this is kind of God's scourge, scorn, our punishment, our plagues. There is a movement to try to educate people that silence on homosexuality is just going to equal death, of not reacting. You need to act out about the AIDS epidemic because people are dying all across this country and nothing is being done to address it properly. There's this focus on, again, a call for research. So there's this movement of really a lack of intervention, right? We core that into the neoconservative movement, and there's also the social moral values of reacting to what's going on. And so definitely there is conflict happening during this time period. We see this huge gap really kind of coming along, but especially in the early years, the death rate was extremely high. The number of AIDS cases being diagnosed throughout the 1980s skyrockets, and even the deaths are continuing to rise pretty steadily, but eventually there will be a decline after more research, after more knowledge is disseminated. But still, many, many cases. The more common or more current contemporary issue that is being dealt with. There's also looks at what groups are more affected, where are the largest statistical counts being seen, and there is a much larger percentage of African Americans that were contracting it, especially homosexual male-to-male sexual contact is where a lot of these were being seen. So some people believed, oh, this was only something that African Americans could get. This is only something that homosexual men could get. And so there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of attacking in media and mistreatment that's happening throughout the country. And in 1988, the U.S. Surgeon General, the kind of the head medical, if you will, head in this country, sends out a public service announcement in 1988 of helping people understand AIDS, the largest public health mailing in U.S. history, trying to understand what really is going on in their country, because so many people really didn't know. And this is all sort of happening during Reagan's. A lot of these things are breaking out in Reagan's earliest years. A lot of it will trend out, and we see the large trends of the economic policies, but a lot of these frameworks are really seen domestically in his first term. And in 1984, when it rolls around, despite all of these social changes, we saw the economic tick, we are going to see a new challenger. A man by the name of Walter Mondale and his vice president candidate, the very first female vice president candidate ever for both parties, both major parties, is going to be Geraldine Ferraro. And she is going, they together are going to attack kind of the Reagan deficits, and they promise to raise taxes to end America's debt, which isn't necessarily the most popular thing to run on, but they're going to try to create this big wave of change. Geraldine Ferraro was the first Democratic VP candidate, and Sarah Palin in 2008 is going to be the first Republican female VP candidate. And these are really the only female VP candidates we have ever seen to date. This may change in 2020. The candidates have not necessarily been announced yet, although there is speculation that the Democrats this year may put up a VP candidate to go along with the ticket with Joe Biden, but we don't know at this point in the year. Ultimately, Reagan is really going to push this idea of leadership being this primary issue, that we're not finished yet, right? You ain't seen nothing yet. He says very commonly, really engages people. And Reagan is going to win in a landslide. He's going to attract actually even more Democrats over, and he is going to win one of the largest presidential victories in all of American history in 1984. Look at this. The only state he does not win is Minnesota, and he also doesn't win Washington, D.C. He wins 525 of the 538 possible electoral college votes. He wins by an absolute landslide. So people call the election of 1980 the Reagan Revolution. It's this massive wave, this Republican wave that we're going to see ride all the way out. This is going to end our video today in our beginning look at period 9, especially the Reagan administration. We covered a lot of the domestic things, big picture trends that we're going to be seeing today, so it turned out to be a little bit of a longer video. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to drop a comment down in the section below, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Until next time, folks, where we're going to be looking at the foreign policy of Ronald Reagan, that famous speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. We're going to see maybe a focus on Star Wars. We wonder what that's about, and we're going to also look at the end of the Cold War. So come back next time, right? I'll see you soon, folks.